Why don't you like to be called Clay anymore?
No, Clay was not my name. Clay was a white man's name. It was a slave name. And I'm no longer Clay. I'm no longer a slave. So now I'm Muhammad Ali.
When you think about black culture in America, one of the most distinctive and fascinating elements is the naming tradition. From the creative names like LaToya and Deshaun to names with deep historical roots like Harriet and Frederick, African American names tell a story of resilience, adaptation, and cultural pride. But where do these unique names come from, and how have they evolved over time? To understand the origins of African American names, we need to look back at the complex history of Black Americans. Names serve as a window into that history, reflecting the impact of slavery, emancipation, the Great Migration, and the rise of Black cultural identity. Before the transatlantic slave trade, African naming traditions were deeply tied to cultural, spiritual, and familial practices. In many African societies, names held profound meaning. They often reflected the circumstances of a child's birth, the community's aspirations, or connections to ancestors and deities, as well as religious or spiritual beliefs. Naming ceremonies were significant events, celebrating the arrival of a new member into the community and affirming their place in the lineage. When Africans were forcibly taken from their homelands and brought to the Americas, these traditions were disrupted. Yet, traces of African naming practices would survive and re-emerge in unique ways over the centuries. One of the first acts of dehumanization during slavery was the erasure of African names. Enslaved Africans were stripped of their original names and given new ones by their captors, often European names that reflected their owners' identities rather than their own.
I want to hear you say your name. Your name is Toby. What's your name?
Kunta.
This act was not just practical, but symbolic, severing ties to African heritage and asserting control over the enslaved. Enslaved individuals were typically given common English names like John, Peter, or Sarah. Yet, even under these oppressive conditions, enslaved Africans found ways to retain a sense of identity. They often gave each other nicknames or used secret names within their communities to honor their African roots and maintain a sense of self. After emancipation, naming practices began to shift. Freed African Americans saw an opportunity to reclaim their identities. Some chose new names to symbolize their freedom and break from the past. Biblical names like Elijah, Isaiah, and Mary were popular, reflecting the deep religious faith of many in the Black community. Others adopted surnames that carried symbolic weight. For example, some chose Freeman to emphasize their newly won freedom, while others took the names of famous abolitionists or historical figures like Jefferson and Douglass. These choices were acts of empowerment, asserting individuality in a society that continued to deny African Americans full equality. The early 20th century brought the Great Migration, when millions of African Americans moved from the rural South to urban centers in the North and West. This migration not only changed where Black Americans lived, but also how they named their children. Urban environments fostered creativity and cultural exchange, leading to the emergence of distinctive naming trends. During this time, names with French, Spanish, and other European influences became popular, reflecting a desire to project sophistication and worldliness. Names like Monique, Antoine, and Jacqueline became common. At the same time, African Americans began to embrace unique spellings and combinations of names. This creativity was a way to assert individuality and cultural pride, setting their children apart in a society that often sought to homogenize Black identities. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s sparked a renewed interest in African heritage and cultural identity. This era saw a rise in the use of African-inspired names, as well as names that reflected Black pride and empowerment. Leaders like Malcolm X and organizations like the Nation of Islam played a significant role in this shift. Malcolm X, for instance, rejected his slave name and adopted the X to symbolize his lost African ancestry.
What is your real name?
Malcolm X.
Is that your legal name?
As far as I'm concerned, it's my legal name.
Have you been to court to establish that you are?
I didn't have to go to court to be called Murphy or Jones or Smith. excuse me for answering you this way.
That's
If
all
a
right.
Chinese person were to say his name was Patrick Murphy, you would look at him like he's insane, because Murphy is an Irish name, a European name, or the name that has a Caucasian or white background. And a yellow person, Chinese is a yellow man, and he has nothing to do or no connection whatsoever with the name Murphy. And if it doesn't look proper for a person who is yellow or Chinese to be walking around named Murphy or Jones or Johnson or Bunch or Powell, I think it would be just as improper for a black person or the so-called Negro in this country, as we're taught by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, to walk around with these names.
Others followed suit, adopting African or Arabic names like Amina, Jamal, and Khadija. This period also saw the rise of distinctly black names, characterized by unique prefixes like La, De, and Shah. These names, such as Latoya, DeAndre, and Shaniqua, were often created by combining elements from different cultural influences, again in an effort to preserve a unique black identity.
Cassandra and her daughter, who has a very unusual name. In fact, we can't pronounce her name, but we can tell you it has over 1,000 letters. We had to create a special graphic for her name. Take a look. That is her name. That makes Letitia LaShawn look simple. Letitia LaShawn Shante. Her birth certificate is 2 feet long. She has the longest personal name in the world, according to the Guinness Book of World Records. And we want to ask her mother, what were you thinking?
I had to do something to break a Guinness Book record. I had to make sure that her name was going to be unique. I didn't want her name to be like anybody else's. Make sure.
What is her
nobody
name?
else-
What is her name?
Say it for
It's
Mom.
Roshandy Antonishan Vision Kishan Simon Drew Shalinda Shakane Ronquel. Ninja Shamika Shanet Tamika Shawahini Vianshel Kani Satsan Janich Marane Kunsai Kirkanisha Devon Yvonne Lutani Sivan Tay Pranki Salaviva Zanfisa Jesslyn Sajave Loya Vet Sparkly Sandra Kate Kati Vishon Orly Vakashawa Lisa Nethe Shots Mekmane Loisa. My middle name is Kunyan Scott.
Your middle name?
By the 1980s and 1990s, hip-hop culture had become a dominant force in shaping African American identity. Names became even more creative, reflecting the boldness and individuality celebrated in the music and fashion of the time. Artists like Tupac Shakur and Nasir Jones popularized names with African and Arabic roots, inspiring parents to choose names that carried cultural significance. At the same time, unique spellings and phonetic innovations became even more popular. Despite their rich history and cultural significance, African American names have often been stigmatized. Unique names are sometimes dismissed as made up or unprofessional, reflecting broader societal biases against black culture. This criticism ignores the fact that all names are, in a sense, made up. Yet, African American names are often singled out for scrutiny, revealing underlying racial prejudices. For African Americans, names are more than just labels. They are expressions of history, culture, and resistance. They represent a journey from forced assimilation to creative self-expression, reflecting the resilience and ingenuity of a community.